So, hello everyone. Everyone's here now. I put up the program for today. We're going to talk about double-edged bishops. And we are mainly going to use the chat function. So, if I ask a question, or when we get to the puzzle section, then you can always chat the answer to me. You can only chat to me, so you're not giving away an answer or anything. So that's a great way for all of you to chip in with an idea. So, okay, let's get started. So this idea of the double-edged bishop is from my 2014 book, The Secret Life of Bad Bishops. But this class here is called, or the program is called Complex Middlegames. So I will focus entirely on the middle game. In my book, I also have endgame positions and one opening position, because I want to find out what the bishop can do on its own. That's why I had bishop against knight and bishop against rook in the endgame, for instance. So, but here we will focus on the middle game. And if you have looked at the puzzle, you will see that I will point out those bishops that might be double-edged, and I've asked you to evaluate them as one of the first questions in each puzzle. So that's what we're going to do today. So let's start out with a definition. So in my book, I write a bishop that cannot yet be declared good or bad, but rather holds the potential of becoming good as well as the risk of becoming bad. So basically, we just don't know yet. And then I write about a bad bishop. Analysis of all relevant other factors in the position will show that a bishop has definitely gone from double-edged to bad. So there's no coming back. And then we can declare the bishop for a bad bishop. So the problem is in a lot of game commentary, if a bishop is behind its own pawn, the annotator is quickly to announce the bishop a bad bishop. And that might be, it's often premature because there are these other factors, they might influence, so the bishop is not alone. So the two main other factors down here, it's space and additional pieces. So we will get a lot into that in all the examples. These are the two main factors. But we're also going to talk about the positions in general, try to figure out what's going on and what's the most important. Then I have a term I call the goalkeeper. And I didn't actually use it in the book, but I think it's a nice analogy. So in European soccer, you have 11 men on a team, and one of them is just there to keep the ball out of the goal. So he's there to guard the goal. And in many sense, you can see, let's say, a so-called bad bishop as being the goalkeeper. So as long as the rest of the team can go and score goals at the other end, it's okay to have one piece that is only devoted to defense. So that's the idea of the goalkeeper. The problem is, of course, that if your position overall is passive, then it's not only the goalkeeper's fault, then it's also the fault of the position. So, but it happens too often that all the blame the blame is put on the bishop. So it's a bad bishop's fault. But often, if you have a bad bishop, you also have a position problem, so to speak. Okay, then we can talk a little bit about the difference between bishop and knight. And there are some obvious, when the bishop becomes bad, it's because it only operates on one color square. And let's say the knight can change color, so it doesn't have that problem. The bishop is colorblind. Then the bishop is long range, the knight is short range. So they are really different pieces. But when the bishop becomes a bad bishop, it's usually because it's totally helpless to what's going on the other color of itself. And then there is a controversial point, slightly, I guess, although I think many strong players would agree that the bishop is slightly stronger than the knight, materially speaking. It's simply a better piece. And there's this Russian saying that even the worst bishop is better than the best knight. And I have one example from The Secret Life of Bad Bishop that I want to show you. I think it shows that there might be some truth in this. The main idea is, at least that's how I present it, is that no matter how bad the bishop might look, there will always be a point in the game where you have to try to win. You exchange of some pieces of pawns, and then the position will open up. And then the bishop will somehow show its long range abilities. So that's one part why suddenly it shows its strengths. I will show that with that one game example. Another point one could make is that the bishop is never entirely alone. So you could try to, the king is always there as a piece who can protect both squares and then pawns too. So the bishop is never completely alone in terms of trying to play on the other square color, the other color complex. So that's just an interesting point to make. But basically, in many of these positions, it's a fight between bishop and knight. Then we will also touch upon a slightly advanced example, such as in many positions, we actually have to get rid of this double-edged bishop to break through the position. And then one can ask the question, then was the bishop then so bad if you had to exchange it to break through? So, and then in some positions, you can even sacrifice that bishop that looks like a bad bishop. That's what we're talking about here. And then there's this idea of if the opponent has a bishop that has the risk of becoming bad, then you could try to exchange other pieces around it to isolate it, and then try to prove that it's bad. So, and then there's a few examples with exchange sacrifices. This is a theme for a later class, so I won't do too much of that, but there I have a few examples just to show the idea. So, okay, let's get started. Let's get into some positions and see what the double-edged bishop is like. So I will unshare for a moment and then share the screen again. So here's quickly two open examples where we early on, let's say on move 10, can start to see what bishops might become bad. So let's take a position like this. So this is an opening line from the French Advance. So I actually treat this opening line in my book. And as in many French lines, so the white bishop on c1 and the black bishop on e6, they are the bishop that could become bad. So they are in risk of becoming bad. But we don't know yet because there's still a lot of pieces on the board, and there are actually also a lot of pawns, and we are only 10 moves in. So it's really early to say. White has space in the center here with e5, but black also has some space over here. Let's say could try to use his majority to maybe play g5 or maybe f4. So it's simply too early. So from black's point of view, black would see this as his goalkeeper. So this bishop is just keeping his position together, defending all the weaknesses. And then black is hoping for, yeah, I can play with this, maybe the rook. I can play with all the other pieces. I have different pawn breaks, pawn pushes, stuff like that. So as long as I have a lot of pieces I can play with, I don't mind having this bishop on e6 that just keeps my position together. So it's at this point it's simply too early to talk about this bishop being bad. It's just visually it looks bad because it's behind its own pawn and cannot move. But But there are too many things going on in this position to simply call this bishop a bad bishop. So one idea in this position, and a lot of theory moves revolves around this idea, is that, let's say, white would like to exchange these two bishops. That would deprive black of the bishop pair, but also it would try to isolate this bishop on e6. So a move like h4 would typically be replied with h6 because black wants to put the bishop on e7. And if bishop e7 here, then white is quick to play bishop g5, and then he kind of gets what he wants. So another thing going on here is white shouldn't castle too soon. It's a possible move, but then bishop e7, and then suddenly black has control over the square and can play g5, because h4 is no longer possible because black can take it. So in this position, you can actually say from black's point of view, because black has this bishop on e6 that guards everything, it gives black great flexibility, and he can actually do a lot of things without thinking too much about his weaknesses. d5 is definitely, it's isolated and could be attacked by the knight. f5 maybe too. So the bishop is doing a great job defending those pawns. Okay, so that was one example. Let's go to another opening. So this opening has been, the King's Indian has been popular since, especially since the Zurich 1953 tournament, where Bronstein played some good games there. So let's have a look at, this is the classical variation with e5. And then a very popular variation nowadays is the Middlegames platter with knight e7. And in the King's Indian, we usually have these two bishops, which could become bad. So they are like in the risk zone. But again, this is simply too early to call the bishops bad. And nowadays, nobody really questions this King's Indian bishop as being the bad bishop because it's behind their own pawn or whatever. So King's Indian player nowadays, they simply know that this bishop is great at defending the king, that it has great potential. Suddenly there could be some pawn sacrifices. So that's because there are other pieces in the position. There's a lot of things going on. It could also later drop to h6. But as a double-edged bishop, or let's say a goalkeeper, there is also this idea that the bishop can drop back to f8 and then guard the vulnerable point d6. So black also has this strategic idea of, he's not even trying to free this bishop. He's just want to put it on f8. So you're my goalkeeper, you defend my weakest point on d6, and then I use all my other pieces here to attack the white king. And in the King's Indian, it's very difficult for white to exchange queens. It rarely happens, at least not after d4, d5. It's something that black can avoid. And in general, a lot of pieces stay on the board. So black always have some kind of play. So there's the other factors like additional pieces. And if black gets to play f5, f4, black will also get space on his own. So my point is that the King's Indian is so popular opening nowadays that nobody really questions this bishop on e7, but it's actually a double-edged bishop, as is white's bishop on e2. But right now it's also doing a great job defending, especially the c4 point, or maybe b5, also along this way. So, and white King's Indian players, they also know how this bishop can become strong later, especially with the space that white has in the center. So space and additional pieces, these are the two main factors. So we are only at move 10, all the pieces are still on the board. this is simply too early to call any pieces bad at this point. So let's move on. Okay, so let's start with an example of one of my own games. So I've been playing some tournaments recently. It hasn't gone so well, but this is one of my better games. I'm black. So let's see it from the black side. So this is the Berlin variation in the Spanish. And one main idea of not playing these two moves is that we can drop back the bishop, the knight to d6, and then we are attacking this bishop. So this is what happened. And then the normal move here is the main move is bishop takes c6, but he played this sideline. This is a French-Canadian IM I was playing against. And then this curious a4 move. It's a sideline, but it's very dangerous. This knight on b5 is now trapped. So black gives it back, and then d5. And now we get into an interesting position, which is it's knight against bishop, but of course there's a lot of other pieces on the board, but basically this is the fight. And white is trying to play on the dark squares where he's very strong. And we'll probably try to, if white could somehow exchange these two bishops, that would be great. I would try to isolate that bishop on c8. But in many of these French positions, these are against the two positions. This is not a French position, but it happens a lot that is those two bishops that are in the zone, the risk zone of becoming bad. So let's see what happens. Knight to a5, and now queen d7. White is trying to play f5, that's why I played g6. And this is a little bit dangerous for black. And white could maybe have played something like c4 here in this position. Play it now instead of later. We'll get to compare the positions. But he just goes along with the attack. So he actually sacrifices 2 pawns now because my king is stuck in the center and I'm lacking development. So he really goes for the attack here. He goes f5. And he played very fast. So this seemed to be like preparation. Now, if I take with a pawn, his queen comes out here, and this is actually very dangerous. Let's say king moves here, and bishop g5. And he already has connection between the rooks. The rook comes in. This is very dangerous for black. So I decided to take with the queen. So this is not really about having a nice pawn structure like this with black. We're talking more about, for black, it's about getting the pieces out and surviving this assault, because white has, after all, given away 2 pawns. Now rook e1. See, at this point, I was very skeptical about this pawn sacrifice. So I was actually starting to play for a win here. I had offered a draw a couple of moves earlier before he started attacking me, because I was not really in the mood playing. It was the last round. But now when he played like this, I was thinking about playing something like this and then check with this. Bishop there, and this is okay for black. And we see some of the same ideas like this. I just want to keep this this kind of like holding my position together. So this is fine for black. So this is an endgame where I'm totally okay. If the queens go off, I'm probably fine. But I decided to play for more here. So I simply defend my pawn on d5. And now he plays queen f3. And I put my bishop on e6. And now he plays bishop f4 and now queen a6. So the game is starting to turn now. I think his last chance here was probably to play knight c4, using the fact that this rook is hanging on a8. And once I move my queen, he can get the knight back, and then he can take this pawn, and then he has the knight is back in the game. It's a very complicated position. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think white has compensation for the pawn, so but maybe not more than that. So it's definitely an interesting position. Okay, so he didn't do that. Bishop f4, and I suspect he was counting only on queen b6, and then he could play knight c4 with the same idea of the rook is hanging. But queen a6 is strong. Attacking the knight cannot go to c4. And then if he takes this pawn, I have king d7 here. And he has problems with his coordination here, will lose a piece. Let's see. Yep. So so he played c4. And so the reason why I show you this position is for black, it's about getting the pieces out now. It's not so much about, I'm behind in development, so I shouldn't try to keep a nice pawn chain or something. Pawn structure is not the most important here. I'm already 2 pawns up. I just need to get my pieces into the game. And this is my goalkeeper in this position. It's kind of like keeping the e-file closed. It's protecting all my possible weaknesses. And if I can survive this, I don't mind having this bishop here on e6. It's very useful to me. So I just need to get my pieces into the game. So I castled. And although I have a horrible pawn structure here, I am actually winning the game because my pieces are active. And so the game is definitely turning here. So it's about piece activity, not pawn structure here. So let's see, he took, and now I'm winning due to this pin on the knight. And after his next move, I have a little tactic that wins. I gave him a check here. So the idea is to take on d2 and get down to b2, which is a target. And then I also have this pin along the second rank. So if king moves to the corner, then I can play something like this, and then c3. So, and all the time, all this tactics is happening. I'm just very happy that I have, this is always keeping my position together. So if you have a position where you reduced your own weaknesses, that gives you more freedom going forward. So that's another way of seeing the goalkeeper, which is great. If there's a lot of loose weaknesses, then you also have to be more aware of your own deficits in the position. So queen b6, he played bishop e3, and then rook takes d2 is a nice little tactic. Yeah, if queen takes, bishop takes here, then the rook is hanging on e1, so that doesn't work. So in the game, he took here, and then he took back, and then he resigned when I took on b6. Now I'm simply 2 pawns up with the bishop pair against the rook. So this is a winning endgame. So my bishop on e6 actually never moved, but it just protects everything. And in terms of being the goalkeeper, I can play with this and I can play with this. So probably I'm not going to move this bishop in the next couple of moves. I simply don't. I don't have to. So I'll probably bring my king up or whatever. So it's still my goalkeeper there on e6. Okay, let's take another example. Let's see what this is. Yeah, we're not going to look at that game. So this is an example I used in my book, and I think it's a great example. So let's see what's going on in this position. It's white to move. Does anyone remember this game for, let's say, my book or my book presentation in the Marshall? So it's a great example. So I was going to show it anyway. So there's this idea this simplified idea about bad bishops, that if they are behind the own pawn, then they're bad. And then if you then put them on the other side of the pawn chain, then they're suddenly good. So the idea of the double-edged bishop goes beyond that. So it's simply about, so it doesn't really matter where this bishop is on the board. It could be, it's just compared to the pawns here in its own pawns here in the center, and the fact that all other white's pawn are on dark square. So this bishop, although it looks great on this long diagonal, it's still a double-edged bishop because it's not attacking anything concrete. It's attacking thin air. You know, it's dependent on other pieces in the position. So if we exchange all the pieces and we had this endgame, this knight on d6 against this bishop, the bishop attacking nothing, and then the king starting to go into the game like this, then black would be in trouble. So that's why this bishop is a double-edged bishop. It really does depend on other pieces and other factors in the position. So we could say the same about this bishop. All the white pawns are on the same color as this bishop. And it's not really, yeah, it could end up becoming bad, for sure, this bishop. We don't want an endgame with all the pieces exchanged where we have this knight against this bishop on d2. But these are all hypothetical scenarios. They're not going to happen right now because there's a lot of pieces, a lot of things going on. But in the position, white played this surprising move. Bishop takes d5. Black took back. And then he played rook c2. So the brilliant thing about this decision of just taking that knight on d5 is simply that white realized what the most important thing going on in the position is. And the most important thing is that this is not going to be very strong. If white has the initiative and black doesn't have an attack going, then it's not so dangerous that this bishop is you know, taking up a lot of squares around the white king. If white can keep the initiative, and white is hoping to do that because the knight is on d6, we have space here in the center. The pawn on e6 is a possible target. This knight is a little bit off. But in the end, the most important thing going on in this position is actually the queenside pawns, which can easily be attacked. So here are some ideas. Bishop can go here. Knight can jump here. Rook can go to c7. So what really goes on in the position is these queenside pawns over here on the queenside. So this is really a brilliant game by Jeparinov. So let's see what happened. He simply played rook c2. And now knight e7. Rook goes to c1. Let's just focus on the main line here. Rook d8, rook c7. something like this. King comes out. So now white is starting to expand on the queen side. Again, these are the main targets for white. So it's difficult for black to do anything against it. So now we have a clear target here on A7. And this target is actually so clear now that in a moment, white is willing to exchange rooks because that will make it easier for his king to get in. And then if A7 drops, then we have a strong passed pawn here. So it's just very instructive to see how helpless black is against this idea. So white has a kind of a perfect setup where his own weaknesses are it's very limited what black can attack. We can point at 2 pawn weaknesses here, but b5 is defended by the knight and h2 is not going to happen. But a7 is really weak. So first he kicks away this knight because it cannot come to the queen side. It has to go to g8. And now he decides to keep the black king out, and now it just goes for a7. So this is how the game, now he just keeps the bishop on this diagonal so he can make the exchange bishop for knight. And when that happens, I think you will agree with me that suddenly this bishop turned from, let's say, double edged to bad, because we have a classical knight versus bishop in game that is good for white. But of course, there are other problems with black's position. He's a piece down, he's a pawn down, and so this is what happened. This is, by the way, a nice setup where the black king cannot go anywhere. So white is just slowly improving his position, make the exchange. And then so next part of the plan is simply to try to attack these weaknesses with the knight. So in positions like these, the bishop can do nothing. The knight just jumps around, create weaknesses. Now we will tie down the bishop to this pawn. And the king will make its way into the position here. If king e7, then I believe we can take this pawn, because bishop takes, pawn promotes. And if king goes the other way, then we go here and take the e6 pawn. So this was a great game by Chebarinov. Really impressive. And it all started with that bishop takes d5 decision, very deep. So he really understood what was going on in this position. Let's try to go back. So I have one improvement for black that I want to show you as a possible. So another reason why bishop takes d5 happens now, that black could get this idea of playing knight e7, and then suddenly you can take back with a knight on d5. So there's also a time issue here. White wants to do it now, then bishop has to, and then black has to use additional moves to get, if black wants the knight to d5. So a knight on d5 would definitely give more protection to the queen side on the dark squares. So after bishop takes d5 and rook c2, black has this idea of playing knight h8, which I think is a very logical idea. You're trying to take your knight, which is not so well placed, and then exchange it against this strong knight on d6. So let's follow the lines. And then rook to c7. And then this is a problem. If black plays like this, he's going to be in trouble in these opposite color bishops. white's bishop is definitely still a double-edged bishop, but now it's definitely doing something with the rook. So I think with the rook still on the board there, I think we will call this a good bishop. But whereas black's bishop here is, we can really question this bishop. As long as the rook cannot cooperate with the bishop and create some threats against the white king. I'm not sure exactly what this bishop is doing on d5. This is looking great. So this is great for white. The rook takes g7. So at this point, white cannot really take the knight on d6. So rook c7, let's say rook d8. Knight jumps to b5 now. So white doesn't want to exchange the knight. And again, this is the main thing going on in this position. The pawn's on the queen side. And now something like this could happen. And then the bishop can jump to e3. This is what white wants. And then suddenly these pawns will come under attack for sure. And this, actually, white will win a pawn now because we have a double threat here. So one last point I want to make here is in this position, after knight b5, black could play a move like bishop e4, trying to open up for the rooks on the d file. And then if white just goes along with bishop e3, which is where white wants the bishop, then rook d1 exchanged a rook, something like this. Then rook d1. And then maybe black starts to get some counterplay with an active rook. And then suddenly this bishop starts to make a lot of sense in cooperation with the rook. So in this case, we would say that the bishop maybe is active on e4. But after bishop e4, white can play this move bishop e1. And then basically there is no check on d1. And black is not really breaking in with the rooks, and the pawns over here is hanging and the pawns are still weak. So after this move, something like this, white again goes for the endgame. Rook d1, we can play king f2. And this is completely different story. Let's say here. Now, black could still try to be active, but now it's a completely different story with white's activity here. So now this knight is in trouble. And yeah, this is great for, I think I analyzed a little bit further. Now we can get into an endgame like this. And let's just take a few more moves like this. And then suddenly our double-edged bishop here is probably turning into a monster soon. And we have a passed e-pawn. So, and look how this bishop is also defending the pawn on b2 and just keeping everything together. So this is great for white. So, but the idea of bishop takes d5 at the beginning was definitely non-standard, and Chiparinov saw really deep into this position. So, okay, let's move on. So at least I want to show you that example where, yeah, this is the example I want to show with bishop versus knight. So this Russian saying that even the worst bishop is better than the, no, even the worst bishop is better than the best knight. Yeah. So this endgame, I was actually black in this endgame, but we can keep it like this. So black has got everything he wants here. So the bishop is on the same color as the pawns, which might not be a bad idea because the pawns are easy to defend. But white cannot really do anything. He's just waiting for for black to try something, and then white has to counter and try to make a draw. So not only could you argue that the knight is better than the bishop, but in addition to that, black has all this king space. His king is already up here and much more active than the white king. And the black king is ready to break in here. The knight is attacking this pawn on g3. So this looks really great for black. So only problem is I didn't find a win. So black is unable to win this position. And the reason for that is, I think we're going to look a little bit into this endgame because it's very recent. It's very instructive. So let's say king d3. Black has to try something, but when he does that, black is also taking a risk because, let's say, from white's perspective, the bishop can make sure that there are no weaknesses, which means that that frees up the king and maybe the other pieces. Again, the bishop is never alone. There is a big fat target on g6 and then maybe on h5. And then these passed pawns over here will start to roll. And then white can also argue, yeah, but if we go into a pawn race, then I have my long-range bishop, which the knight on an open board is not that great. So again, at some point when the position opens up, the bishop will show its strength. There is also this curious theme of, in many of these bishop versus knight endgames, I do write about that in the book briefly, is there are actually many of these endgames where you can sacrifice the bishop to gain time. Because the knight is so slow moving across the board, so the idea of sacrificing the bishop just to gain some time, and then the knight has to fight pawns, and the knight going across the board being slow. So that is definitely an idea that happens in those endgames more than you might think. So there are also a few lines in this endgame. So let's try to see. So this here is more about trying to get an understanding of bishop versus knight. So let's do this endgame for a while. So now white goes for the g6 pawn. And so there are different lines. Let's just take one of them, like this. And in the game, I was low on time, so I took here, and then this was a fairly easy draw, something like this, the pawn race. We got into this, and then it was a draw. So taking knight takes b4 is not really the most testing. So let me just show you one line where white is actually able to sacrifice that bishop for time. So let's see, knight takes c3, king takes g6, bishop moves, and then b4. So what would you play here with white? Let me get some ideas. It's actually the only move. So from a practical viewpoint, it's you know, black probably has good chances of winning this endgame, but when I analyzed the game, I didn't find a win. So of course it's easier to be black, I would say, but so white has to find an only move here. You can put your suggestions in the chat. Yeah, Matt, you got it. That's the idea. And once you know this idea of, yeah, Paul, can you follow up with a few more moves? Just so I see the idea. So I collected quite a few of these positions where you can actually sacrifice the bishop. It's kind of like a little bit of an overlooked theme in these bishop versus knight. And I think it contributes to this, the reason why the bishop might be a stronger piece than a knight, simply from a material viewpoint. Yep. Paul, you got it? So the idea is simply bishop takes b4 here. And then we don't take back, then we go ahead and take the h5 pawn. Because now the knight has to spend 2 moves taking this pawn and then get all the way back. So again, far into the endgame, position opens up. The knight will be, slow piece. So this is definitely an idea. So this is how my main line goes. Something like this, check. Both get a queen, but this is a draw. So let me see. Okay. Let me see. Yeah. Let me just see. Let me unshare for a moment. And let's see. I want one last position before we go to offline and go to the puzzles. And instead of going through this position, I think I want to ask you a question. And then we can do that the rest of the time. Maybe start a little bit earlier with the puzzles. So let's say this was another game I played recently, one of the few good games I played. So we get this Slav line. And it's noteworthy. Now I played c5. It's noteworthy that these double-edged bishops, it's usually in positions like that are closed or semi-closed, and then you have a lot of pieces still left on the board. Then you can start to look for bishops that might be double-edged. So, so let's take a few more moves. Let's go for this position. So what can we say about this bishop on d2? So there's a lot of questions like that in the puzzle. So let's just take it right here. So let's say something useful about this bishop on d2. Yeah, Paul, I think we had that in game briefly in the endgame class. I wanted to make a point of it, so we had it briefly. Yeah, I remember. So let's try to evaluate bishop d2 and say something reasonable about it, because that's what we're going to do in the puzzle section. So it's totally buried behind its own pawns. Let's say even if black exchanges all these pawns over here, all the remaining black pawns are still, let's say, on like this, very solid pawn structure. So what is this white bishop on d2? What is it actually doing? So what we can say something about this bishop on d2 in connection with the rest of the position. So what are the other factors? What is going on in this position? I will give you a little time to think about it. Okay. So one thing we notice is, so the two main factors was space and additional pieces. So we noticed that white has space on the queen side. And in many of these positions with c4, c5, c6 is the possible weakness, let's say now or later in the endgame. It's always a weakness, a potential weakness. So white has space to compensate for, let's say, this double its bishop on d2. Then there are also additional pieces, and that gives more options. So right now that this bishop, I'm not too worried about it. It has several ways to get into the game. It might be a useful defensive piece, let's say e3 or other squares. So I'm not too worried about this bishop on d2 being a bad bishop. So actually, if you see, let's say, very strong players, they don't talk about chess in terms of, let's say, too much about good and bad pieces like that. It's more like they just look at the position very concretely and what's going on. So, so this bishop on d2 is just one factor among many in this position. And of course, there's a potential risk, and that's why we should look out for this bishop. So we don't want suddenly to maybe to exchange this bishop on d3 for no good reason, or maybe other pieces, and then we end up isolating this bishop on d2. So we still have to think a little bit about it. So let me just show you a little bit of this game just to give you a sense. So black decides to go back with a knight. And now black's idea is to play f5, followed by knight jumping back to e4. So I responded with g4. This is a very typical idea, by the way. And then if f5, then g5. And now the knight cannot go back to f6 and e4. And I can start to build up for an attack with h5. I can probably prepare very thoroughly, just lining up on the h file before and then play h5. So with all this space white has gained here, it's very unpleasant for black. There's no really space for black to move the pieces around. So this is not a very good position for black. So after g4, he instead took here, exchanged, and played g5. So he's trying to freeze position a little bit. I brought my queen back because I'm going to attack his king. That's my plan. And we got to this position. He's attacking my pawn on d4. And since my bishops are already pointing towards the king and my knight is not really in the game, I decided to bring the knight closer to the king side, defending that pawn. And now I decided to go rook f3. So with clear intentions of trying to checkmate the black king. A rook left. He prepares to defend against that. And now I played g5. And it doesn't look too great to play g5 because now how are you going to break through? But I had this idea in mind that I wanted to play a piece sacrifice on f5. And we're not going to go into detail with this game. So the point is just that this piece sacrifice works because there are other pieces left on the board. Let's say after I give away this bishop, I still have pieces left to attack, and maybe a pawn here. And so this is one of the things we will look much more into in another class with dynamic piece sacrifices. So this is an example of that. And if we just, for now, if we just focus on this bishop on d2, so it's still not really attacking anything, but it's going to be part of this lot of pieces who are going to attack the black king. So instead of singling out this bishop, I'm just using it as a one among many. So this is what happened in the game. And if he takes that bishop, my knight jumps to g3 and f5. And on the way, I'm also attacking his bishop on e7. So this is not very good for him. So he ended up playing something like this. And now my knight comes in. And bishop takes g6. So I will send the base out after the after this class. So I won't go into too much detail. You will get all the games and all the material from this class. So so the point is just here that yeah. So this bishop was just a part of the position. There was a lot of things going on, and now, well, now it's opened up and it's kind of helping over here. Right now, it's doing a great job defending that pawn, so the queen just can't take it out on g5. So, and then later maybe we can bring the bishop closer. So, yeah, again, this is just, there's a lot of things going on in this position, and of course you need to be aware of that bishop on d2, but. It's just a complex Middlegame position. Just fast forward quickly. Now suddenly we now it's actually game over because my queen is breaking through here. He tried something like this, but then he resigned after bishop f5. He's going to get mated like that. So yeah. So I hope my points came across, and now let's go offline for the next half an hour and do some puzzles. I hope the introduction here, the presentations will help you solve them. And then we will simply be back 8:30 and go through these puzzles. So I'll see you in half an hour.